Christian nationalism, that's what I want to talk about in this video. It's understandable that the assertion of local identity, nation, culture, language, ethnicity, could sometimes be united to an assertion of traditional morality, and in fact, traditional religion, because the monoculture, globalism, homogenizing trends are often united with a new morality, new cultural paradigms that make it easier to destroy old communities and assimilate them. We would say woke culture, for example. However, also understandably, there's a certain skepticism on the part of religious people to the degree that, hey, does the nation then become an idol? Similarly, conservatives, capital C, deep conservatives, would say, well, the nation state is a modern liberal conception. Obviously, it usurps and destroys older institutions, medieval and early modern European institutions that were more in keeping with a Christian ethos. Now, those are legitimate criticisms. I'm not going to talk about ideologies in which the nation usurps, monopolizes the moral concerns of the individual, and the individual is expected to make moral calculations on the basis principally of the national collective and de facto of the state that says that it represents the national collective. I'm not going to defend the nation state and administrative centralization as such, but I am going to defend the idea that the nation is the legitimate constituent of the human family, the righteous human ecumene. In Christian terms, we would say the church, and that the scriptures present a story of national salvation and entry into the spiritual church or the spiritual Israel. Quick note on content going forward. I will make political and cultural commentary, but occasionally there will be videos that are to do with theology, mythology, etc. Not only biblical scripture, but drawing on other traditions as well. This video specifically is theological and drawing out the political implications of nationhood in the biblical narrative and in Christian theology. What is the nation biblically? The nation can be understood from below or from above. From below, the nation originates from the patriarchs that constitute the second generation after the flood. So the sons of Noah are said to receive allotments of the world, of territory, now dry from the waters of the universal flood, and they are to respect the boundaries thereof. So, national differentiation, the territorial delimitation, and the populations that descend from each of these patriarchs of the family of Noah originates peacefully. It does not originate, say, from the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel as a kind of punishment. It originates as the proper expression of the covenant given to Noah and of the earlier command to multiply, to spread over the earth for the seed of Adam. So you have already an ethos, biblically speaking, of territorially bound national communities characterized by common descent from patriarchs. And in Jubilees 8 and 9, which is actually part of the Ethiopian Bible, the Tawidu Church Bible, you get an expanded version of Genesis 10, which gives us a very detailed cartographic breakdown, a very detailed map of the different portions that are given to each of the grandsons of Noah. It describes the river Danube in Europe, for example. It describes territory up to India, etc. From below, but from above, Deuteronomy 32 tells us that the nations are numbered according to the numbers of the sons of God, the sons of El. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, of the Torah, which is pre-Christian, Septuagint, this was rendered as the angels of God, which I think is a fair clarification because under paganizing influence, sons of God can sound like God has a biological relationship with them, or that they can grow up to be God, as a son will grow up to be a father. So in the context of the pagan world, it makes sense that they would clarify that this refers to angels. In some versions of Deuteronomy 32, it says that the nations are numbered according to the sons of Israel, but that seems to be a later addition. In the earliest manuscripts that we have, the ones that were found in Qumran in Palestine, it does in fact say sons of El, sons of God. And in any case, Israel as microcosm of the total human family and of the family of humans in conjunction with the heavenly paradigm, the number would presumably be the same. Now, that number, generally speaking, is 70, sometimes 72, but shortened to 70. And in Luke, Jesus sends out 72 disciples. So he's sending out one disciple per archetypal nation. And then it would correspond to an even higher angelic order of seven, which appears, for example, in the book of Revelation, in John's Apocalypse. So the nations in this context are earthly manifestations, communal bodies corresponding to manifesting higher angelic archetypes. This is exactly what you get in pagan tradition. It is Ugaritic. We have texts to that effect. And of course, it appears in Plato in the Cratias dialogue, and in the Laws talks about how the nations are under the tutelage of high spiritual beings that they were assigned to by the high god Kronos. And obviously, in the Christian context, there is a narrative of the corruption of these higher beings or their supplanting by lower demonic intelligences so that the nations are in need of redemption. With the gospel, you get the Great Commission, in which Jesus tells the disciples to preach to the nations, to make disciples of the nations. So the constituent entering into the kingdom is national. And this is consistent with the Torah. This is consistent with the way in which the prophets in the Old Testament anticipate the conversion, the redemption, the setting right of the nations. Two examples of this idea of the Great Commission bringing in the nations as a fulfillment of the Torah, particularly interesting ones because they concern enemy nations, are Isaiah 19 and Psalm 87. In Isaiah 19, the prophet Isaiah predicts that Assyria and Egypt, famously uh, polities that took the Israelites into captivity, slavery, etc., displace them, will be subject to a similar ordeal to that of Israel, i.e., exile. They will be scattered. Now, scattering, which the language of scattering or exile is often connected to the four directions, you are scattered to the four winds, is an image of the cross, an image of the four directions of the cross. It's the ordeal whereby the created or external form is dismembered, like Dionysus, like Osiris, and thereby discovers that which is transcendent by suspending the outer form, by suspending the form that consists of the four elements, four directions, the four constituents of reality, according to most traditions, you experience that which is essential. In Latin, literally the fifth element, the quinta essentia, the quintessence, the fifth is then experienced. And so you return to yourself, you return to your form in a more self aware way, i.e., you return to your form, understanding it now as emanating from the source, from the divine. You are able to return in submission to the divine, which is why we're told to take up our cross, to carry out the ordeal of the cross in our own life. Isaiah is predicting that this will happen to Egypt and Assyria, and thereby they will receive titles that were reserved for the chosen people, Israel. God will say, Egypt, my people. God will say, Assyria, my handiwork. So these once tyrannical pagan enemies will be chosen nations of God as well. And crucially, they enter into relationship with Israel. We're basically told that there will be a unity between the three, Egypt, Israel, and Assyria. So what you have here is that the chosenness of Israel now includes Israel as a component, but is expanded. Instead of being a nation of many tribes, it is a federation of many nations, we could say. Psalm 87 does something similar. It even mentions Babylonia, great enemy nation of Israel, and it talks about how many nations would be brought in, and God would say of them, this one was born of Zion. So Zion becomes, again, we could say, a federation. The kingdom is multinational, and Israel is mentioned, as in Isaiah 19, as one of those. The notion that the kingdom, or the spiritual Israel, or the church, constitutes a federation of many nations, just as the national Israel constituted a nation of many tribes. The bringing in of the nations, as in Isaiah 19 and Psalm 87, occurs prominently in 1 Maccabees 8, with a clear political content. Here, Judah Maccabee, who is rebelling against the pagan rulers, heirs to the Macedonian Empire of Alexander the Great, appeals to political entities that he considers to be spiritually in sync with the people of Israel, namely the Spartans and the Roman Republic. And the letters that are reproduced in the Bible from Judah Maccabee refer to this potential for a political alliance against oppressive imperialism. So the political alliance is the proper means for expressing human unity. You retain different nations within the alliance because you recognize a common spiritual principle. You do not conquer and invade and oppress each other. And the idea here is similar to Acts 2, in which many nations are mentioned. They are the nations that receive the blessing of Pentecost, and Judea is one of them. It's not that it is the center, it's not that it ceases to exist because they are now the new Israel, but rather it is one of the nations among them. The same occurs in Luke. Preach to the nations beginning in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, or Israel, or Judea, is one of those nations. And again, Isaiah 19 uses the same sort of language. We can also think of Joseph, one of the 12, who helps the other 12 return to righteousness, but he does not thereby become the patriarch, Jacob. He is a brother who retained a correct understanding of religion, and he helps the other brothers come back to that correct understanding. He does not thereby cease to be a distinct nation among them. He does not thereby become the center among all of them. He is one of many, but he had a particular function, a brother reminding other brothers. And this is how St. Dionysius the Areopagite understands the concept of chosenness. One way to think about the numbers that keep coming up in scripture is in terms of kissing number of spheres. The 6 days of creation, for example, would correspond to the kissing number of a circle. It's the maximum number of circles that can touch a central 7th circle of the same size, which is stationary. The day of Sabbath, the 7th, a day of rest. The 12 disciples, or 12 tribes of Israel, correspond to the maximum number of three-dimensional circles or spheres that can touch a central sphere of the same size. The center is not on the surface. It is not one of the, for example, 12 spheres on the surface, which is to say it does not have definite, particular, contingent features that are to be imitated by the others. They are each to have their own specific place on the surface while being oriented around that center. This is an arrangement which is inherent to a given shape and consists of orderly multiplicity. They are many, but they are ordered because they have a common center. Now, because the center is not on the surface, so to speak, it does not have specific features that you have to look to. It is rather that which each circle or sphere in its own position has in common with the others. It's useful for the placeholder of that commonality to be one of them at a given time, so that they recognize that that which they have in common can manifest in them and in one of them. But ultimately, we are speaking of a spiritual principle. The center does not participate of the surface, and so it doesn't have a particular contingent form for them to look to. And you get the same thing with Jesus in the Gospel of John, saying that it is good for his disciples that he ascend and leave them, because otherwise they will not receive the Spirit. And they do receive the Spirit at Pentecost. It blesses the diversity of nations. The Logos manifests in the harmony between different forms, not in a particular physical form among them for them all to look at. The center is not on their level, it is not on the surface. It's the central sphere, not one of the spheres around it. Jesus says to the Samaritan woman that there will come a time when we will not worship at the Pharisaic controlled Jerusalem temple or at the Samaritan mountain, but we will worship God in truth and in spirit. That's important because, of course, if he had remained, his eye color, his hair color, his particular height, all of the contingent features of Christ would have risked becoming a idol, another physical temple, another Samaritan mountain. So that makes sense of why he says, I have to ascend and leave you in order for you to receive the Spirit, i.e., in order for the Logos to manifest as a harmony between you rather than as a particular form that seems to be one among you. Another way in which Scripture relates this idea is the tree of life and its recurrence. Then the tree of life in Ezekiel 47 and again in the Apocalypse in the book of Revelation at the very end, chapters 21 and 22, does return to the earth, but it returns as many trees for the healing and the feeding of the nations. It is now a plurality of trees. It is one type, but it manifests as many. That's extremely significant there. Now, the number 72 is 6 times 12, which relates to the 12 gates of the heavenly city through which the nations enter, presumably the 72 nations, so 6 per gate at the end of John's revelation. It also happens to be the kissing number of sixth dimensional spheres. So again, the principle here is ordered harmony. The number 70 is a shorthand for 72 as the total number of archetypal nations making up the human race. However, you could also, by looking at Ezekiel 35, where Israel and Judah are referred to as two nations, think of the number 70 as the total number of nations from the perspective of the Old Testament Israelites, excluding themselves, which is to say, excluding Israel and Judah. Reason why, during the events of Pentecost, when the Spirit is said to descend upon representatives of all the nations to which the apostles were preaching, such that they were able to hear the word in their own languages, meaning that their languages were blessed rather than they being made to hear Aramaic and understand it, or the liturgical language, Hebrew. Their languages became part of that covenantal glorification of the divine. The reason why during that event Peter then quotes the book of Joel, which talks of sons and daughters becoming prophets and so on, is not just to identify the events of Pentecost with that prophecy, but also to anticipate what's going to come after. Because the book of Joel and the section that Peter quotes includes a violent prophecy. Violent events are coming. In fact, Pentecost is violence against the authorities that wanted a monopoly on truth, that would consider it offensive for a heavenly mandate to descend upon languages other than their liturgical language of Hebrew. And in addition to that, it's an anticipation of the events of 70 AD, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. So we should read Acts 2 in conjunction with the so-called Olivet Discourse, in which Jesus predicts coming destruction in that very generation. The historical context for John's apocalypse is the violent upheaval of the first century, in which Titus destroys the temple. And in fact, arguably, the eighth chapter of the Apocalypse precisely gives us the heavenly view of Pentecost, the casting down of liturgical fire from a heavenly mass is then manifested as the tongues of fire. And it is a violent act, as it's portrayed in Apocalypse 8, because it is an act of spiritual warfare against corrupted spiritual authorities, just as the confusion of tongues at Babel was. But it is a blessing. It's not a confusion as a punishment. It's a blessing, albeit that blessing is a blessing to the nations, to the righteous, but it's not a blessing to the religious hypocrites, etc. Now, this judgment is not only a judgment against the religious authorities at Jerusalem, the false prophet who in 13:13 of the Apocalypse seems to conjure up his own fire from heaven, his own false Pentecost, to incite worship for the sea beast, the fallen or tyrannical Roman Empire. But it's also a judgment precisely against that Roman Empire. In other words, the Roman military force that is used to bring low Jerusalem, not just the false authority of the false prophet who works with the beast, but the apostate city, sinful human community in general, which is Jerusalem as whore of Babylon, fulfillment of tyranny because she rides upon the sea beast, but ultimately turned against by that beast, by political power. Whereupon, after serving as an instrument, spiritual judgment also falls on that beast, and they are all cast out, all the servants of the dragon, of the ancient serpent, of the devil, by the end of the book of Revelation are defeated. But it's important that the whore of Babylon has a cup in which she mixes the blood of the saints. This is the image of sort of erotic cosmopolitan entropy, the mixing and destruction of all forms. And it's important that the beast had 10 horns and 7 heads, which parodies the number 17, the 17 nations present at Pentecost, depending on how you read Acts 2, which are a shorthand for 70, 10 plus 7 instead of 10 times 7, the total human community. So this is a parody in the sense that it is a tyrannical unity of the nations rather than a harmony between the nations. I would argue that the whole trajectory from critique of false unities, Assyria, Babylon, the beast in the apocalypse, and the looking forward to true unity, the coming in of the nations into the heavenly city, as anticipated by Isaiah 19 and Psalm 87, coming to term in Apocalypse 21 and 22, is the same movement of thought that is taking place in Plato's Laws, his final and most mature work. It is the setting up of a potential Greek federation, by whatever name, that might benefit from the economies of scale, let's say, of an empire, be able to defend itself against aggressors without mimicking that which Plato criticizes about the Persian Empire, the pitiful plight of peoples that are all jumbled together under the yoke of imperialism of the Persian rulership. So it's this same idea, from false, unsatisfying unity to genuine unity, which consists of a harmony in which individual constituents can retain their own character. Eric Voegelin, in The Ecumenic Age, talks about this in the context of Plato, provides a very helpful analysis. But the point is that the assertion of national character and cultural diversity functions in the Bible to fight back against tyrannical and spiritually perverse, corrupting structures from the Tower of Babel to the apostate religious authorities at Jerusalem and Roman Empire in its negative guise. This is particularly relevant today given the all-consuming, ever-trampling global monoculture and its ever-mutating moral structures. But we have here an obvious political implication of the biblical theology of nations. So then, the main ways in which Christian discourse, especially traditional Christian discourse, might reject plurality, diversity, the salvation and harmony of nations in their distinctiveness is by identifying the unity of God with the uniformity of human culture, which, of course, the unity of God does not require uniformity of human culture, but diversity of human culture, so that we see that no one culture can exhaust the creative power of God. No one language can express the divine mystery, the divine sacraments in terms that are exhaustive. That's the point. Diversity is a good way to realize that God exceeds all particular things. And St. Thomas Aquinas makes this point in the Summa Theologica. Nicholas of Cusa makes this point in On Learned Ignorance. The diversity of forms, including of nations, illustrates that God is beyond any particular form, and so his creative power always produces plurality, always produces variety, and at the same time, they show that the divine oneness is at the root of all reality by being a cohesive unit in themselves. Reality consists of units because unity, oneness, is the mark of the author of reality, of God, who is one. Each thing a cohesive unit in itself, forming larger units with others, and at the same time, reality consists of diverse forms because that author, the divine source, exceeds them, and its creativity is always unexhausted, always produces more. The idea that eventually all human diversity would be done away with thanks to the gospel because nations no longer have above them a particular archetype, a particular angelic steward, but are all directly under God alone in the way in which the Old Testament Israel was, and so eventually will all come under one earthly government and speak one earthly language, i.e., primitive Hebrew, is what you find in Origen of Alexandria. The scholar Jean Danielieu summarizes Origen of Alexandria's view, what we could call the uniformalizing view of salvation, in which we all become the same, as follows, quote, "The political order, dependent on the existence of a variety of nations, was henceforth over and done with. Origen regarded polyarchy, many kingdoms, as a system going with polytheism, many gods, worship of many gods. Monarchy was to appear at the end of the world." So, in contrast to this, Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, in the Celestial Hierarchy, says that all nations do in fact have a presiding angel, so differences among humans stem from angelic heavenly archetypes, let's say, thoughts in the mind of God. But in the case of Israel, what happened was that they held true to only worshiping the divine source. It isn't that they or any other nation is lacking in an angelic archetype. In fact, nations can only come about because they have some angelic image that they manifest. Similarly, gender and differences in personality type would presumably come about because they reflect some higher principle. But you should not worship the particular. You should retain it, baptize it, transform it, so that it is harmonious with the higher principles and with others on its own level, but you shouldn't make an idol out of it. So Dionysus presents a middle way. You do not abolish particularity, you do not abolish diversity, but you also do not worship it. That was the mistake of the nations. They worshipped the angels as gods. You do not abolish it, but you also do not worship it. That is the middle way of Dionysian Christianity, which Origen fails. And we see that today. The difficulty people have in celebrating their particular identity and character without invoking superiority to others, and the difficulty they have in retaining the idea of diverse identities that all share common principles without imagining a future in which all differences melt away, everything mixes together and becomes uniform, globalist, homogenized, monocultural. Arthur Lovejoy, in his excellent The Great Chain of Being, talks about this and contrasts it to the view of St. Thomas Aquinas, in which diversity is a good in and of itself and is not done away with by the gospel, but is baptized and retained under a Christian dispensation. Quote, Origen had declared that God's goodness had been shown at the first creation by making all creatures alike spiritual and rational, and that the existing inequalities among them were results of their differing use of their freedom of choice. This opinion Aquinas declared to be manifestly false. Quote, this is from Aquinas from the Summa Theologica. The best thing in creation is the perfection of the universe, which consists in the orderly variety of things. Thus, diversity of creatures does not arise from diversity of merits. In other words, we're not different only because one of us is better than another, every difference having to exist within a hierarchy. Two colors can't be different, they must be better or worse. Red and blue can't be different from each other without red being better than blue or blue being better than red. That's what Aquinas is rejecting here. We continue. But was primarily intended by the prime agent. So diversity, differences were intended by God. St. Thomas Aquinas understands that in order to retain diversity and for each diverse form to be an icon of the divine oneness, they have to have their own centers, their own cohesion, and therefore borders between themselves. They are in harmony with each other, in community with each other, but they are also cohesive in themselves. So they have borders between each other. In being a unit, you can reflect unity. In forming greater, harmonious units with others, you also reflect unity. In being different and distinct from each other, you are showing a particular archetype manifesting that's different from that of your neighbor, and therefore you show that the divine oneness is beyond both of you, is not exhausted in either of you. So it makes sense that for St. Thomas Aquinas, kingdoms are justified in retaining their integrity, and in his commentaries on Deuteronomy, kinship bonds are taken into account when determining who can join your kingdom because you are to retain your character as a distinct nation among other nations. So there is a political corollary to this metaphysical defense of difference or community and identity or cohesion, community with others, cohesion in yourself. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope that was interesting. Again, this was a very theology and scripture based video. I plan to touch on different topics on this channel. Until next time, and subscribe if you'd like to.